So in this session, we're going to look at the enhancements that have been made for debugging PowerClient, PowerServer, and 64-bit client-server applications. First, a legal disclaimer. So the first thing we're going to look at is the prerequisites in order to support the debugging. Then we're going to look how we do the debugging with 64-bit client server. Then we're going to look at how we do it with PowerClient, and lastly, we're going to look at how we do it with PowerServer. First, a little bit about myself. I assume at this point that most people already know who I am and the company I work for. So, prerequisites for client server. It's pretty simple. You need to have already done the work you need to do to make your application 64-bit deploy capable. If there are 32-bit ActiveXs that you're using, you need to get 64-bit versions. If there's API calls you're making, you'll need to evaluate whether you need to make changes in order to call them from 64-bit mode. 64-bit database drivers, that kind of thing. That's all you need to do. Once you've done that, once you've actually got a 64-bit application, you can debug it directly from the debugger in the PowerBuilder IDE. With PowerClient, the way the debugging is done is by a process that attaches to the running client. So what you need to do is get the client on the local machine, which means you must deploy it to the server, and then you must have the Cloud App Launcher installed so it then downloads the client back down to the local machine. And then the PowerBuilder debugger connects to this process that talks to the running PowerClient application. Same thing with PowerServer. You want to deploy it to the server so that, and then re-download it through the app launcher so that the process that's running can attach to the running PowerBuilder client for the PowerServer application. What this means for PowerClient and PowerServer, though, is that you always want to make sure you deploy before you debug. If you don't do the deploy step, what you may end up trying to do is you may try to end up debugging code that hasn't been actually deployed into the client that you're interacting with yet. So always deploy and then debug. So for client server, it's actually fairly simple. There's just this drop down in the main toolbar right to the right of the run icons. You get the debug, the run, and run icons, and then you've got this new drop down, which indicates whether or not when you click these buttons, whether it's going to fire in 64-bit or 32-bit mode. So just pick x64, hit debug, and you'll be debugging in 64-bit mode. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So this is the sample application I'm going to use to demonstrate debugging. And this isn't necessarily an example of a robust application. In fact, I've gone out of my way to try to do things to break operations in PowerServer. But just to show you a few items here, not necessarily breaking PowerServer, but just having to do with process bitness. So here I have just to check to see what bitness the application is running in. Here I have a Windows API call that has to be called differently depending on the bitness of the application. And so we can validate that we are actually debugging in 64-bit mode. You see this is the toolbar item at the top here. It says x64 and x86. And this not only applies to the debug options, but the run options as well. In fact, if I can go over here and I'll click on x64, go ahead and run this. Check bitness, we're in 64-bit mode. Whereas if I set the drop down to x86 and run it, we are in 32-bit mode. So let's go ahead and switch that back to 64-bit and run the debugger. And I've got a breakpoint set in here. So you can see I'm actually stepping through the code now, but we are in 64-bit mode. Okay, so that's debugging in 64-bit client server. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is how we do this with PowerClient. Now, one thing you'll need to do is in the project itself, you're going to make sure that you have enable debug symbol selected. And then this drop down doesn't come into play anymore. What's going to matter down here for both 32 and 64-bit is just which one of these you select. So if you deploy a 32-bit client, you're going to be debugging a 32-bit client. And if you deploy a 64-bit client, then you're going to be debugging that client. You'll notice what I've done here is I've actually got separate projects for all the different options. I've got the straight 32 and 64-bit client server applications, the 32 and 64-bit Power Client, and 32 and 64-bit Power Server. At that point, rather than hitting this button for debug, there is a debug option in the painter for the Power Client project. So you use that debug project to debug the Power Client application. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we do that. So here we're going to debug our 64-bit Power Client deploy. Notice that I've created a project here for both 32 and 64-bit. This is the 64-bit one. We are not going to use the drop down up here or these buttons to debug. What we're going to use is the debug project button that appears when the Power Client project is open. Now, I said when I was presenting the slides, you need to make sure that you've deployed your latest code to the server before you attempt to debug. And we're going to see an example here of what happens when you don't do that. I have not deployed the latest copy of the code to the server. So when I debug, the Power Client installer is going to run. It's going to think it's up to date because it's up to date with what's on the server. I'm going to debug. I'm going to do this check bitness. And notice this should be the code that is in my command button for the clicked event for that button. And instead we're looking at a bunch of instance variables. So that's what happens when you don't have the latest copy deployed to the server. So I'm going to stop the debug. I'm going to deploy. And now I'm going to debug. And now we see the correct spot code. And once again, obviously prior to this, you couldn't debug this in either 32 or 64-bit mode. Now you can do both. This happens to be the 64-bit version that's running. Okay, so that is debugging Power Client. And then finally we have PowerServer. Same thing as Power Client. You open up the PowerServer project, make sure you have enabled debug symbol selected, determine whether you're going to be debugging a 32 or 64-bit client. And once again, it's the debug project is in the toolbar for the PowerServer project, not the PowerBuilder, not the debug option up in the main toolbar. Click that, and that will launch the PowerServer application and then allow you to debug it. With PowerServer, though, there's a little bit difference between it and the client server or Power Client because, obviously you've got this C# code server side. We're not debugging that. We're debugging the PowerBuilder client. The other big difference when you do client server and PowerBuilder, when you do client server and a PowerClient, you're running just PowerBuilder code and everything's supported. When you run PowerServer, there's a number of, and it's not a huge number, but there are some unsupported features. And depending on if you have the unsupported features in your code, you may find that the breakpoints don't actually occur when you're debugging. For an example, you may have code in your SQL preview event. In client server and in PowerClient, the SQL preview event fires for select, insert, update, and delete. In PowerServer, it only fires for retrieve. So if you've got code in your SQL preview and you're debugging and you do the retrieve, it's going to work fine. But when you do your insert, update, and delete, it's not going to fire because there's actually nothing there for it to, the event's not supported in that case, and so your debug point never gets fired. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And so now we're going to look at debugging PowerServer project. Similar to the PowerClient project, we are not going to use the toolbar icons up here. There is a debug option now here in the Painter toolbar that only appears when you've got the project open. Once again, I've created projects for 32 and 64-bit. So we're going to run this. It's building. We're going to be a little bit here. Okay, I'm going to wait for this to finish here. Okay, so same thing as far as these breakpoints. This is as with PowerClient, we're running against the installed version of the client, and so I had to make sure that I had most recent version updated to the server. And you can see this is the 64-bit mode. Although previous to this, you can debug PowerServer deployed apps in either 32 or 64-bit. The differences here, though, are going to be when we do stuff like, let me do a retrieve here, and notice I'm in the SQL preview event, and it did stop here. Although technically, SQL preview, this syntax that we're getting actually doesn't even mean anything, because that is the SQL that the data window would generate it on the client. It's not. It doesn't have anything to do with what the server is actually running. So even though it is supported on the initial select, I'm not sure it actually means anything. But notice I've got cases in here for the insert, update, and delete. And we'll go ahead and let that run. Well, this is the retrieve row event. I'm doing something else unsupported here. I am trying to attempt to retrieve another data window. I can access the data from the row it was retrieved, and I actually can do embedded SQL against the row retrieved, and I get the data back. But when I go to retrieve another data window from the retrieve row event, I will get a -1 error from the retrieve functions. Meanwhile, in PowerClient and in client server, that actually worked. I'm going to remove that breakpoint so we don't keep hitting it. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and update this to, let's say, 4, and and issue an update. And notice we didn't get a breakpoint. The update worked, but for the update, insert, and delete, the super preview event doesn't even fire. And so just a couple things you need to be aware of here with differences when it comes to unsupported features when you're debugging a PowerServer application. But there you are. Okay, and that's all I had, so it's time for questions and answers.